In the winter of 1327, as frost covered the rooftops of small English villages and the smell of wood smoke clung to the narrow streets, a marriage contract between two families could determine the fate of an entire generation, and if you were suddenly transported into this world of rigid duty, suffocating customs and unbreakable social hierarchies, you would discover very quickly that marriage in medieval times was not a fairy tale union, but a battlefield where survival depended on obedience, alliance, property, and the whims of a society built on control. To understand why you would struggle to survive such a marriage, you must first picture the world you would be stepping into, one where your identity was not shaped by love or freedom, but by your family's needs, your economic value, your gender, your dowry, and your ability to serve the expectations of a community that believed personal happiness was irrelevant compared to social order. Medieval marriage was not a private emotional commitment between two people but a public institution, a binding contract whose purpose was to strengthen alliances, transfer property, secure heirs, and maintain stability within a deeply stratified society. For noble families, especially in England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, or the Iberian kingdoms, marriage was an extension of political diplomacy, where a girl of 12 or 14 could be promised to a man she had never met because the union would preserve land rights, expand influence, or secure a feudal alliance, while among peasants, marriage served as the foundation of economic survival, where a husband and wife were expected to work together to manage land, livestock, and household responsibilities. But even here, love was rarely the basis for choosing a partner, as families negotiated unions based on labor value, reputation, fertility, and the approval of the local church. The church, which held immense authority over every stage of life, declared marriage a sacrament, unbreakable and sacred, but this did not mean it protected individuals from misery. Instead, it bound men and women together regardless of compatibility, abuse, or personal desire, and once you were bound, you were trapped, especially if you were a woman, since medieval Europe offered almost no legal pathways for separation, and none for divorce as understood in the modern world. Courtship did not resemble modern romance, but followed strict customs determined by your class, and if you lived among commoners, your parents or village elders would arrange your match, considering factors like your ability to bring livestock, tools, or labor skills to the new household. While among the nobility, marriage negotiations could last years, involving priests, bishops, notaries, and political advisors, and you would have no say in the matter, even if the match meant spending the rest of your life with someone decades older than you. The age of marriage alone would shock modern people. Girls could be betrothed at 7 or 8, married around 12 to 14, and expected to bear children as soon as their bodies allowed, while boys often married later because they needed land or resources to support a household. But even then, many were pressured into unions that served family ambitions rather than personal choice. Once married, your duties were not optional but strictly enforced by custom and law. If you were a woman, you were expected to manage the household, produce and preserve food, tend to livestock, spin wool, make clothing, support your husband's labor, obey him unquestioningly, and bear as many children as possible, and failure to fulfill these responsibilities could bring shame, punishment, or accusations from the community, while men were expected to provide for the household, defend property, contribute to village labor systems, uphold honor, and maintain discipline within the family. Intimacy within marriage was governed not by mutual desire but by religious doctrine, with the Church insisting that sex should only occur for procreation, never pleasure, and clergy wrote detailed confessional guides explaining when intercourse was allowed, when it was sinful, and even which positions were acceptable, meaning your private life was monitored by spiritual expectations that modern people would find suffocating. Domestic violence, which modern society condemns, was widely accepted as a husband's right, justified as a method of maintaining order, and medieval law codes from England to France allowed men to correct their wives physically as long as the violence did not exceed certain limits, though these limits were rarely enforced, making marriage especially dangerous for women who had little legal protection and no economic independence. If you were a noblewoman, your situation in marriage might seem more luxurious on the surface, but it carried its own brutal pressures, as your body was effectively a tool for political strategy, expected to produce heirs, especially sons, and failure to do so could result in humiliation. Abandonment or confinement to a convent, many noblewomen died during childbirth due to poor medical knowledge, and those who survived often endured repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths, all while navigating court politics, rival queens or mistresses, and the constant threat of being replaced or sidelined. The social surveillance within medieval communities was relentless, with neighbors observing, judging, and reporting on your marriage, as the stability of the village depended on each household fulfilling its role. This meant that personal disagreements, conflict, or private suffering rarely stayed within the home, and the pressure to maintain appearances could crush anyone lacking the emotional resilience demanded by the era. Marriage also fused two families, not just two individuals, leading to constant involvement from parents, siblings, and extended kin, who monitored your behavior, intervened in disputes, and ensured that the union served the collective interest rather than your personal comfort. Your autonomy would shrink drastically, and modern ideas about personal boundaries or marital privacy would be unimaginable. Economically, marriage was a survival partnership rather than an emotional bond, and failure to cooperate could lead to starvation, loss of land, or legal penalties, especially since medieval society lacked social safety nets, meaning widows, abandoned wives, or infertile individuals were at risk of poverty, exploitation, or forced remarriage. The emotional burden of such a life, combined with the rigid gender roles, lack of personal choice, and overwhelming societal control, would make survival in medieval marriage extremely difficult for a modern person accustomed to freedom, equality, and self-expression. And by the time you witnessed your first winter as a medieval spouse, you would understand that marriage in this era was not designed for love or happiness, but for labor, lineage, and duty. A system created to maintain order in a world where survival depended on obedience to customs much older than yourself. By the summer of 1382, when the bells of village churches echoed across the farmlands of England, France, and the German principalities, a husband and wife living in a medieval household found themselves bound not by affection or personal freedom, but by a rigid system of expectations that dictated every moment of their day, every duty in their marriage, and every consequence for failing to meet the demands of a world shaped by hardship, limited resources, and unyielding tradition. This world did not understand the modern concept of personal fulfillment, and if you stepped into it, you would quickly learn that marriage was a labor contract disguised as a sacred institution, one that consumed your time, your energy, your identity, and, in many cases, your safety. A medieval marriage required both partners to work from dawn until dusk, and the household economy was so fragile that one mistake, one bad harvest, or one disagreement about labor roles could plunge the entire family into disaster, forcing you to follow strict routines that allowed no room for rest or personal choice. If you were a woman, the moment you opened your eyes you were expected to tend to the fire, prepare grain for baking, milk the animals, fetch water, spin wool, mend clothing, care for children, and keep the home spotlessly functional because your value as a wife was judged through your productivity, cleanliness, obedience, and ability to stretch limited resources. A modern person, accustomed to individual schedules and personal space, would crumble under the constant surveillance of a mother-in-law who shared the same home or a neighbor who felt entitled to comment on your cooking, your clothing, or your fertility, because in the medieval world, the community believed it had the right to intervene in your marriage, correct your daily habits, or report your failures to the priest, all in the name of social stability. If you could not handle being watched at all times, marriage would become unbearable. Men, too, carried suffocating pressure in this era, because a husband who failed to harvest enough grain or produce enough livestock was publicly shamed, fined by the manor court, or forced into debt to buy food for winter, which meant your daily responsibilities as a husband were not only physically draining but emotionally exhausting, and unlike modern households where men and women negotiate roles, medieval gender roles were absolute, and no excuse for failure was tolerated. Conflict inside the home was not a private matter, but something the entire village felt responsible for. If a wife argued too loudly, disobeyed her husband, or challenged his authority, neighbors could step in, priest could intervene, and village courts could punish her, while a man who failed to control his household could also be humiliated in front of other men, making marriage not just a personal relationship, but a public test of one's competence and honor. Marriage also required emotional endurance far beyond modern expectations, because husbands and wives rarely had the luxury of marrying for compatibility, and many couples entered marriage without ever having a single private conversation. The first night together could be awkward, frightening, or even violent, and yet you were expected to adjust immediately to sharing a bed, a home, and a lifetime of responsibilities with someone who might be 20 years older, someone you might dislike, or someone whose temper or habits you could not predict. If the marriage was unsteady, the church offered almost no solutions, because once two people were married, the union was permanent, absolute, and unbreakable except in rarest of legal exceptions involving fraud or impotence, meaning you could not escape a cruel spouse, a loveless home, or an abusive environment, and many women found themselves trapped in dangerous marriages with no hope of relief, forced to endure suffering as part of their spiritual duty. Pressure to produce children made marriage even more terrifying, especially because medieval medicine offered no understanding of reproductive health, no safe childbirth practices, and no protection against the dozens of complications that ended the lives of mothers every year. Childbirth was so dangerous that priests encouraged women to confess their sins just before labor because they might not survive, and if you were a bride of 13 or 14, your immature body put you at an even higher risk of dying before reaching adulthood. Meanwhile, husbands suffered their own burdens. Because a childless marriage was seen as a failure, blamed almost entirely on the woman, and if a wife did not produce an heir, the man's property, reputation, and family line were threatened, leading to constant frustration, suspicion, and resentment inside the home, and in noble marriages. Infertility could spark political crises, annulments, or forced separation. Medieval homes were small, cramped, and lacked privacy, and newly married couples often lived with extended family, which meant that arguments, intimacy, childbirth, sickness, and financial decisions happened in front of others, stripping away the privacy that modern people consider essential. You could not shut a door to escape conflict, you could not choose to sleep alone, and you could not avoid the opinions of parents or siblings who believed they had authority over your behavior. Hygiene was limited, sickness was constant, and marriage required patience with conditions that would horrify anyone living today, from lice infestations to cold winters without adequate heating to the stench of chamber pots emptied into streets each morning, and yet couples were expected to function, cooperate, and reproduce. Within these conditions without complaint, social norms were so deeply ingrained that you were expected to accept your fate without rebellion, and anyone who rejected marriage customs faced severe consequences. Women who resisted arranged marriages could be disowned, imprisoned, or forced into convents, while men who tried to marry outside their class could lose land, inheritance rights, or feudal protection, demonstrating how medieval marriage was not a personal milestone, but a carefully controlled institution designed to preserve social stability at all costs. Emotional expression within marriage was also vastly different from today. Husbands were discouraged from showing affection or weakness. Wives were expected to remain humble and silent, and both were trained to suppress emotions for the sake of duty. which created an environment where love rarely grew and was often considered a luxury reserved for poets and storytellers, not real life. Even when affection existed, it was restrained, private, and overshadowed by economic necessity. In noble marriages, life could be even more dangerous, as political marriages placed young brides into courts full of intrigue, rivalry, and manipulation. A noble woman's slightest mistake, misplaced alliance, or failure to produce a son could cost her her status, her safety, or her life. And even noblemen faced constant pressure to uphold family prestige, fight in wars, or manage estates responsibly, making marriage a political assignment rather than a source of companionship. For peasants, marriage offered survival but demanded endless labor. For nobles, marriage offered status but demanded sacrifice and obedience. And for both, the emotional and psychological strain would overwhelm any modern person accustomed to choice, freedom, and personal rights. By the time you lived a single year in a medieval marriage, you would understand that survival did not depend on love or compatibility, but on endurance, submission to social expectations, physical strength, and an acceptance of a harsh world where marriage was designed not to nurture individuals, but to maintain the fabric of medieval society through discipline, ritual, and duty. By the year 1415, when the winds of late autumn swept across the thatched rooftops of medieval Europe, and the sound of church bells mingled with the clatter of horses on cobblestone roads, the everyday reality of marriage had become so deeply intertwined with the legal, religious, and economic structures of society that survival within this institution required not just physical endurance, but an ability to navigate a suffocating network of obligations, authorities, and consequences that controlled every aspect of a husband's and wife's life. To exist inside a medieval marriage meant living in a world without privacy, autonomy, or escape, where a single argument could become a matter for the village court, a single mistake could tarnish a family's honor, and a single accusation could bring shame severe enough to affect the future of your children. The Church exerted the greatest influence over marriage, declaring it a sacrament that could never be undone, and priests held the power to judge whether a relationship was sinful, lawful, or appropriate, giving religious authorities control not only over the ceremony but also over disputes, inheritance, legitimacy of children, and even the bedroom, since couples were expected to follow strict guidelines influenced by theology and superstition. If you struggled with religious rules or resented outside interference in your personal life, you would be overwhelmed by the constant intrusion of clergy who believed they had the right to instruct you on intimacy, childbirth, and behavior. Medieval laws also placed heavy restrictions on marriage, especially regarding property, inheritance, and social rank. A marriage between people of unequal status required approval from lords or local magistrates, and if you married without permission, you risked losing land, forfeiting your dowry, or having your marriage declared invalid, which meant your children could be labeled illegitimate, a devastating social stigma that could destroy their future prospects for property or marriage. Women in particular faced crushing legal vulnerabilities, since marriage transferred control of their property, labor, and even personal mobility to their husbands, leaving them legally dependent and unable to make decisions without male approval. A modern woman, accustomed to owning her belongings, choosing her work, or participating in financial decisions, would find medieval marriage suffocating, as wives could not sign contracts, travel alone, or testify in court without their husband's consent. In many regions, husbands could legally discipline their wives, and while the harshest abuses were technically discouraged, enforcement depended on local custom, meaning that a woman married to a cruel man had little protection, few rights, and almost no path to safety. Neighbors might intervene only if the violence disrupted community harmony, not because they believed a woman deserved protection. And the Church often advised wives to endure suffering with patience rather than seek escape. Men, too, carried their own burdens because a husband was held responsible for the moral behavior, work ethic, and religious duties of his wife, and if she was considered lazy, disobedient, or scandalous, the man was blamed as well, meaning a husband lived under constant pressure to maintain order in his household, uphold his family's reputation, and avoid becoming a subject of ridicule or reprimand in village courts. In this environment, even small marital conflicts could spark public disputes, since neighbors, priests, and local officials believed they had a responsibility to maintain community harmony, which meant that arguments over chores, livestock, finances, or child discipline could escalate into legal cases where each partner's faults were aired before the entire village. The idea that your private disagreements would remain private simply did not exist, and a modern couple accustomed to handling problems quietly would not survive the constant involvement of outsiders who insisted on shaping the rules of the marriage. Another harsh reality of medieval marriage was the overwhelming fear of poverty, a threat that shadowed every decision a couple made. With no welfare, no public hospitals, and no social programs, a failed marriage economy could mean starvation, homelessness, or forced labor, and the survival of the household depended on tireless work from both spouses, long hours in the fields, and cooperation that allowed no room for emotional withdrawal or personal crisis. If a husband became sick, injured, or died, the wife and children were left vulnerable, often forced to remarry quickly for protection or risk falling into poverty. While if a wife became incapacitated or died in childbirth, the household could collapse entirely, pushing the widower into despair, debt, or the need to find a new wife immediately to maintain survival. Marriage was less a romantic commitment and more a binding partnership where failure could have life-threatening consequences. The pressure to produce children intensified the struggle, since child mortality rates were devastatingly high, and couples were expected to bear many children in the hope that at least some would survive to adulthood. For women, this meant enduring pregnancy after pregnancy with little medical knowledge, no pain relief, and high risk of infection or death. While men were burdened with the responsibility of feeding a growing family, managing resources, and expanding agricultural output during a time when famine, disease, and warfare were frequent threats. Parenting was also infused with community oversight, as neighbors judged a couple based on the behavior, health, and morality of their children, and any failure to discipline or instruct them properly could lead to gossip, fines, or intervention by the church, making marriage not only a union of two adults, but a public performance in which an entire household was scrutinized for religious obedience, productivity, and order. If you married into a noble family, your challenges were even more complex, because political marriages came with the expectation of loyalty, cunning, and alliance building. Noble spouses often lived separately, maintaining large households and navigating court politics that involved betrayal, strategic friendships, and the constant threat of being replaced by rivals or dismissed from influence, especially for women who failed to produce heirs. Even everyday roles were exhausting for nobles. Husbands traveled frequently to manage estates or fight in wars, while wives oversaw large staffs, organized finances, maintained noble etiquette, and represented the family in social events, all under the watchful eyes of servants, advisors, and political enemies. One misstep, rumor, or scandal could jeopardize the entire family legacy. Within peasant households, work never ended, and the emotional strain of constant labor combined with a lack of personal freedom created marital environments where affection was often secondary to survival. Couples grew close through shared hardship rather than romance, and modern expectations of emotional support, intimacy, or equality would be unimaginable in a world where each partner's value was measured by labor, obedience, and contribution to the household economy. Social customs further restricted marriage, as festivals, laws, and rituals reinforced strict roles and punished deviation. For example, A woman who failed to keep a tidy home or perform expected duties could be ridiculed through public charivari rituals, where villagers mocked her with noise, songs, or symbolic humiliation, while men who failed to properly care for their wives could face similar scorn, showing that marriage existed under constant threat of public judgment. Even the simple act of choosing a spouse was influenced by limitations that modern individuals would find impossible to accept. Marriages were arranged based on land, dowry, alliances, or local customs, and personal desire was rarely considered, making compatibility a matter of chance rather than intention. And once married, you were expected to remain loyal, dutiful, and committed regardless of unhappiness, abuse, or disillusionment. By the middle of the 15th century, the idea of marriage as a lifelong emotional partnership would have been unthinkable to most medieval people, who viewed it instead as a necessary structure for social order, economic survival, and religious duty. In such an environment, modern expectations regarding personal freedom, mutual respect, communication, and shared fulfillment would collapse almost instantly under the pressure of unbreakable customs, unbalanced power, crushing labor, and the absence of individual rights, making it clear that surviving a medieval marriage required strength, endurance, and acceptance of hardship that few people today could imagine, let alone endure. By the early spring of 1479, when Europe stood on the edge of religious reform, political upheaval, and emerging Renaissance thought, the nature of marriage remained firmly rooted in medieval expectations, making it one of the most demanding, unforgiving, and tightly regulated institutions of era. And if you found yourself suddenly living inside such a marriage, you would quickly realize that the emotional, physical, and social pressures would be far beyond anything a modern person is prepared to endure. The daily grind alone would break most people, because marriage was not designed for companionship, but for production, duty, and societal order. Every moment of the day was spent laboring toward survival, whether through farming, cooking, weaving, preserving food, raising livestock, or managing children, and none of these responsibilities could be postponed, negotiated, or outsourced. In a world without electricity, running water, or modern tools, household tasks consumed hours of effort. Grinding grain by hand, hauling water from distant wells, preparing food from scratch, stitching torn garments, tending animals, mending fences, managing fires, and preparing for winter in a constant cycle of exhaustion. A modern spouse accustomed to personal space, emotional boundaries, or breaks for rest would find this lifestyle overwhelming, especially because spouses were not partners in the modern sense, but complementary laborers tied together by necessity rather than choice, expected to perform roles rigidly defined by centuries of custom. Men worked long hours in the fields, forests, and workshops, bound by feudal obligations that demanded service to their lord in addition to supporting their families, while women worked inside and around the home with equal intensity, often performing physically demanding labor while also caring for multiple children, some of whom might not survive infancy due to widespread disease and poor medical knowledge. The grief of losing children was so common that parents were expected to continue working even in mourning, with little emotional support from society. The emotional landscape of marriage was equally challenging because medieval culture valued obedience, religious duty, and social conformity far more than personal happiness or communication. Couples rarely discussed feelings, mental health, or emotional needs, and any display of vulnerability could be judged as weakness, sin, or instability. Instead, spouses were expected to endure hardship silently, maintain household order, and submit to religious teachings that framed suffering as a natural part of life and marriage. Husbands were pressured to remain authoritative, disciplined, and financially productive, while wives were expected to be humble, modest, hardworking, and fertile. creating emotional expectations that left little room for affection or mutual understanding. Marriage rituals reinforced the imbalance of power, as vows often included promises of obedience from the wife and responsibility for discipline from the husband, turning the household into a miniature hierarchy governed by patriarchal norms sanctioned by both the church and the community. Intimacy, too, was overshadowed by rigid religious teachings which dictated when intercourse was allowed, condemned physical pleasure, and prioritized procreation above all else. Couples were expected to abstain during Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, and certain phases of pregnancy, creating long periods where intimacy was forbidden, yet conception was still demanded to produce heirs and maintain household labor. Most modern people, accustomed to autonomy over their private life, would find these intrusive rules suffocating and emotionally draining. Childbirth added another layer of terror to marriage, especially for women, because it occurred without anesthesia, sterile tools, or trained medical professionals. Midwives relied on experience, superstition, and herbal remedies, and even a minor complication could lead to death. Women entered labor fearing not only for themselves but also for their babies, and surviving childbirth multiple times was considered a blessing rather than an expectation. Husbands, meanwhile, carried the constant fear of losing their wives to childbirth, which could leave them raising several children alone in a society that offered no support for single parents. Remarriage was not merely a personal decision, but a survival necessity. Illness, injury, and infection further strained marriages because medieval medicine lacked effective treatments for most conditions, meaning a simple wound could become life-threatening and a fever could permanently disable someone, placing immense pressure on the spouse who had to take over both household and economic duties. Beyond the physical and emotional challenges, marriage operated within a suffocating framework of community judgment and involvement. Neighbors believed they had a moral responsibility to monitor marital behavior, and gossip served as an unofficial policing system that reported laziness, disobedience, infidelity, or disputes. If a wife was seen as too outspoken, she could be ridiculed publicly. If a husband failed to provide, he could be shamed or fined by local courts. Public rituals like charivari, where villagers mocked troubled marriages by banging pots and shouting insults, served as brutal reminders that personal matters were never private. Many modern couples would collapse under this constant surveillance, unable to handle the idea that every argument, mistake, or financial difficulty could become the subject of communal scrutiny. Economic strain was another severe burden, as marriage required managing resources carefully in a world where a single bad harvest, a miscalculation, or an unexpected illness could mean hunger, debt, or ruin. Peasants owed taxes, tithes, and labor to their lords, leaving little margin for error. The emotional weight of knowing your family's survival depended on unending labor and flawless cooperation would overwhelm anyone unaccustomed to such pressure. Even noble marriages, often romanticized today, offered no refuge from hardship. While nobles lived more comfortably, their marriages were political tools that demanded public appearances, strategic alliances, and unbreakable loyalty. Noble spouses often lived apart, managing separate estates or traveling for court duties, and they experienced enormous pressure to maintain family prestige, secure alliances, and produce legitimate heirs. A noblewoman's failure to bear sons could result in political isolation, loss of influence, or even annulment, while noblemen were expected to navigate courts full of rivals, spies, and factions, where one misstep could ruin the entire family. Marriage among the elite was a chessboard where affection was secondary to diplomacy, reputation, and survival. Across all classes, the emotional resilience required to maintain a medieval marriage was immense, because life was filled with dangers that modern people rarely face. famine, warfare, plague, fire, and legal punishment for minor infractions. Couples lived with the knowledge that disease or violence could strike at any moment, making marriage not a journey of personal discovery, but a test of endurance where survival depended on labor, obedience, and cooperation. The absence of modern rights, protections, and opportunities meant that marriage was not something you could leave if it became unbearable. Since divorce was nearly impossible and separation left women vulnerable to poverty, danger, or social shame. For men and women today, accustomed to emotional autonomy, legal rights, and personal choice, the oppressive weight of feudal authority, religious regulation, and public judgment would be psychologically crushing. By the end of a single year in a medieval marriage, you would find yourself drained by constant labor, overwhelmed by restrictions, stifled by rigid gender roles, threatened by community oversight, and terrified of the unpredictable dangers that threatened your livelihood, your children, and your daily existence. And this is the truth historians make clear. Medieval marriage was not designed to nurture personal happiness, but to enforce stability in a world built on scarcity, hierarchy, and duty. The reason you would not survive it is simple. Marriage in medieval times demanded unending sacrifice, unquestioning obedience, and physical and emotional strength far beyond what most people today have ever been asked to give.